Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth webinar with English language specialist Julianne Hammack on English as a medium of instruction. We're very proud to be digging deeply into this subject matter over the course of 6 separate webinars. This is number 4 of number 6 on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. to talk about the importance of English as a medium of instruction, how it works, how you can think about it, and to start a conversation with all of you. And so my name is Jennifer Euler from the Regional English Language Office at the U.S. Embassy and Consulates here in Brazil. And I want to provide an introduction to our specialist today. I know you're going to learn a lot. Today's presentation and webinar is going to be about adapting and scaffolding materials for EMI. And so our specialist is going to look at instructional materials, how you can support students working in an English language environment, and where you can find high quality, free materials to work with, and how you can adapt them for content-based instructional models. So Julianne Hammack is our English language specialist today, and she is the Instructional Design and Development Coordinator at the Center for English as a Second Language at the University of Arizona. She develops courses and teaching materials for English instruction and teacher training. She has an MA in linguistics from the University of Texas at El Paso, and an MA in second language acquisition and teaching from the University of Arizona. Beyond that, she's a treasure trove of information, and we will be taking questions from the audience, both in the middle and at the end of this webinar. So if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, please leave them for us, and we will address them throughout the series. So with that, I want to say welcome, Julie, and the floor is yours.
Excellent, thank you. I'm glad to be back. Let me figure out my screen situation here. Okay, so I'm assuming that you are seeing the slides at the moment. So I'm going to, unless anyone tells me different. These slides are available to you, just as they are every week. Noemi and Jennifer will put them into Facebook comments so that you'll be able to follow along on the slides. And today, like Jennifer said, we're going to talk about materials. So we've got our word cloud. I'm starting to really enjoy these word clouds as a way of previewing the content for each webinar. But you'll see the link to the slides here. I follow the similar format every week, so that if you have last week's slides, you can just change the number to 4 and you'll have this week's slides. So we're going to talk about strategies for adapting materials. How do people go about doing that? Where do EMI materials come from? There's not a great, enormous commercial market full of EMI materials we can choose from. So we're going to talk about how we get them, how we find the ones that we need. Then we'll identify some resources that will let you locate materials that you can adapt and turn into materials that will support the instruction you're doing in your classroom. And we're going to discuss how you can use open educational resources to create EMI materials. Those are my goals for today. And just as I've probably said in every webinar so far, there is not a lot of literature in the research about creating English as a medium of instruction materials. So I'm drawing a lot from the CLIL literature, which is a little bit more comprehensive. And so where you see CLIL here, just keep in mind that it's content and language being taught together, where there is a focus on both language and content. But we can generalize some of what we find and discuss how that can apply for EMI in the way that we're planning to do EMI in Brazil. Is there a difference between CLIL materials and EMI materials? Honestly, that depends on the approach that you take to EMI. And in previous webinars, we've talked about what is the role of language instruction in an EMI class, where in a CLIL class, we assume that there's a role for language instruction, but different EMI initiatives take different approaches. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges of materials development. That's something that I've been involved in at the University of Arizona at our Center for English as a Second Language. And so I have some firsthand experience in what that's like to create a body of instructional materials, including textbook chapters. So when we talk about materials, what are we talking about? CLIL materials are assumed to be texts that are in the target language of that CLIL classroom, but not only the texts, but the activities and the tasks that go along with them. And so all three of those things a lot of times are presented together in the form of a textbook, but that doesn't always have to be the way that it's done. But we are talking about the text, the information, or the content, in addition to the pedagogical aspect, all that kind of stuff. And we can think about content in an EMI or a CLIL class in terms of dimensions. So every time you add another aspect to what you're teaching in the classroom, you add a dimension. And Ball talks about the dimensions of content being the concepts that you cover. So what are you teaching about? And that would be the content area concepts. But Ball also talks about language as being a type of content that's covered, in a CLIL classroom. And then procedures. And when Ball talks about procedures, this means the cognitive part, the thinking part, learning strategies. And so it's more of a how type of facet to CLIL content or EMI content. So the conceptual content, the language, which is also a type of content, and then the procedural choices and how you kind of move that learning along, the cognitive part of your teaching. And so we kind of expect all of this to be represented in the materials that we use in our class. And there are wish lists, there are checklists, there are kind of tools for evaluation of materials. I like this one as sort of a wish list or an aspirational list of what we would like to see in the materials that we use in EMI or CLIL or some other content-based approach. So we want materials that make the learning goals clear. So students know when they pick up that material what they're supposed to do with it, why they have it, what they're supposed to learn from it. So this is a part of scaffolding. So making students know why they're there, what's the purpose. And then we'd like to have materials that foster academic language development, academic language of the field in which the students are studying. And we also want to bring up Vygotsky again and that gradual release of responsibility, letting students become more and more independent, more and more autonomous. We want to see if there are ways to build that into the material that we either create or adopt or adapt. Our materials, we'd like them to include different kinds of assessment, including self-assessments that will help students self-monitor their learning and build their metacognitive skills. Peer assessments are another thing that we would like to see included in the materials for CLIL or EMI. This list was specifically developed for CLIL. We would like the students to feel that the affective filter is low. So this reduces cognitive load because students are not simultaneously worrying about whether making a mistake is going to have bad consequences for them or something like that. But we want the materials to feel inclusive. We want the materials to again, lower the affective filter to make students feel like they're in a safe place where they can learn without too much negative affect. We'd like materials to foster collaborative learning. We'd like the things that we use, the activities, the tasks, to allow students to collaborate, because when they collaborate, they're co-constructing that knowledge and they are using language for an authentic purpose. The focus is on the content, but the students are using the language to do that. So we would like to build that into our materials where we can. We would like to incorporate authentic language and authentic uses of language. If students are in a program, say for aquaculture, then they are being socialized into the profession or the professions that are, related to aquaculture. And we want the language that is used in the materials to reflect the language that they're going to encounter in their careers in aquaculture, for example. We would like materials to create or foster critical thinking, of course. We like the materials to kind of scaffold the content, scaffold the language, and scaffold the learning materials the way we talked about in the methodology webinar, and help students build cognitive fluency in those areas. So making them increasingly more independent and able to do things without the extensive support that they get in a classroom. And we like it to be meaningful and relevant. We don't want to use materials that students don't see the application for, or topics that students don't feel are meaningful to their own lives. That's tricky because students are different, professors are different and have different views of what it means to be relevant and meaningful. But here's the $20 question. That sounds great. Where do we get it? Where does it come from? So if I'm an ESL teacher or an EFL teacher, I can go to the catalog of a lot of major publishers and I can choose my heart's delight in series of ESL textbooks that are intended to, teach English to people who don't have English as a dominant language. There are series out there, too many to count, but then you start getting into more focused and specialized language teaching situations like CLIL or EMI, and that stuff's not there commercially. So where do we get it? We have some options here. We can develop everything from scratch. It sounds doable. It's an enormous job, huge. So it's an option, but we a lot of times don't have the resources. It's not realistic to expect to create everything, because that means things like writing the textbook chapter. So writing the content part of that chapter. You need people who know that stuff in order to be able to do that. So it's kind of out of our reach, number one. Number two, we have the possibility of employing undiluted, is the words that they use, authentic materials. So adopting a textbook that is written in the language that you're using in your classroom. You can adopt it the way that it is being given to you or the way that you buy it, and you can give it to your students and say, okay, we're going to use this. That's an option. Now we can kind of see the downside to that option too, being that that material, that textbook was created for a particular audience that does not always assume that people are language learners using that material. It's written under the assumption that people are, pretty high level proficient speakers of the target language. But it's a possibility. And then the last possibility is to take some authentic material, but then work with it and create something that's appropriate for our students in our context. And so those are the things we get to choose from. So let's see what would work best for us. If we talk about adaptation, that can mean a lot of things to different people. So if I give you an academic article or a textbook chapter and I say, I need to use this with my students are level B1 more or less in English. What can I do to make this material accessible for my students? One thing you can do is you can simplify. You can make the sentence length shorter. You can adapt the vocabulary. So you can kind of reduce it by reducing the linguistic complexity of it. Just reducing it to the facts, bulleted list of ideas, things like that. You can simplify. And a lot of people think when you adapt, that's what you do, you simplify. However, you can also go in the opposite direction and you can elaborate. So you can add things to the text that will make it more comprehensible for students. Add some paraphrastic explanation of vocabulary. Add explanation. So expanding the text to help make it more comprehensible is the opposite of simplifying the text to make it more comprehensible. Yet somehow they can both exist simultaneously. And then the last one is probably not a real familiar word. It wasn't for me. And that's the word discursification. And in some literature, it's called rediscursification. Say that 10 times faster. And this refers to taking something that was written as an expository text, a textbook on physics, for example, or an academic article, even better. Taking it from that form and making it something that you can teach with, because that's a different thing. An academic article or a textbook from an academic, or a chapter from an academic textbook, that's one genre, or actually two, but once you introduce like pedagogic material or approaches or structure, you've changed the genre of that material. So you've rediscursified it, I guess is how you would describe that. You're changing the text so that it is pedagogic in nature. It's made for teaching. You can do this by introducing rhetorical questions. You can restructure it so that it looks more like a textbook. It can have annotations. There might be visuals that you add to the text to make things clearer. Of course, comprehension questions or activities that students do alongside of this text, that kind of moves it into the pedagogic realm. Glossaries focus on cognates from the L1 to the L2 that they're using. But anytime you take it from kind of what it was originally intended for, and then you adapt it so that it looks more teacherly, then you have rediscursified that text. All right, so what do teachers really do? Interestingly, I found this, I believe this was a master's thesis, and the writer of this master's thesis looked at what teachers at the university that they were working at, what they did to adapt materials. And this person found that less experienced teachers tended to go with the simplification approach. So you take the text, you take out anything extraneous, and you boil it down to just the facts. And so that's what less experienced teachers kind of conceptualized adaptation as being. All teachers did some form of rediscursification, as they refer to it here. So all teachers moved it into more of a pedagogical type of material. They included the graphic organizers, they included the strategies that students should use, they included glossaries or things. All teachers did that. So it seems to be kind of hardwired in to our training as educators. Elaboration was used quite a bit. The most frequent elaboration strategy that was used was adding redundancy through paraphrasing. So you might use, have a chapter that includes a crazy word like rediscursification, and then you add kind of a parenthetical or, an aside and a positive, something like that, to explain what that is. And then you move on with the rest of the text. And so that was the way that people approached elaboration. So we can see here that simplification, although it might be the first thing we think of when we adapt materials, it isn't the only way, and it may not be the preferred way to do things, although there's a place for everything. So here are a few considerations for scaffolding in different domains. So if we're going to scaffold language, we can take some of the approaches we talked about last week in methodology. Brainstorming, having students generate the vocabulary that they already know about a topic, or kind of contribute some linguistic forms that they know are related to what's being studied. So you can actually structure the text. You take that file, that Word file or whatever format it's in, and you use the formatting features to kind of signpost that text, to structure it. So you can group certain parts of the content together. You can have, boxes that contain special kinds of information. You might have like a text box that includes something students should, like some skills students should try applying. It might be an aside about the use of language, but you can use these tools to make the physical appearance of the text be more interpretable. You can do things like rewriting. So this is not surprising, but some of these suggestions are very specific, and I find that really helpful for myself. You can rewrite it, and instead of using pronouns to refer back to any particular noun or vocabulary item that's in there, repeat the vocabulary item instead of using pronouns, because when there are pronouns in text, the reader has to see the pronoun and know its antecedent, know what it refers back to. That's a little bit of cognitive load that students, if you take it away, might make it easier for students. So rewrite it using the actual nouns instead of pronouns. Shorter, less complex sentences, nothing wrong with that. Removing tangents and asides and all of that kind of extra stuff that is interesting to know about, but maybe not crucial for understanding the concepts, you can remove some of that. That's a possibility for scaffolding language. Provide synonyms for important vocabulary items in the text. Do it as, kind of an in-text definition, and you can add a glossary, you can use footnotes, you can put it in the margins, in comments. There are a lot of ways you can kind of support vocabulary. Annotations in the margins or as hyperlinks. So you can link out to unfamiliar vocabulary. And that's helpful because, if students need to follow it, they can. But if they don't need to follow the hyperlink, they can just keep on reading. So it provides them an option, that's there if they need it. Scaffolding content. So there are things we can do here too. Highlighting or underlining important or key facts. Pretty easy to do, yet very helpful for calling the students' attention to where they need to focus. Include visuals, Venn diagrams, tables, charts, infographics. Something that is not like a linguistic modality, just having that visual support for something that they're reading about can really support their comprehension. Chunking and using subheadings. So again, structure that text. Use the features that are available in something like Word that will help you to make the organization of that material really, really clear. So headings, subheadings, dividing it into sections, things like that. Incorporating graphic organizers, I love those, and there are as many types of graphic organizers as there are things that you can use them with, so don't be afraid to adapt and create something new that's appropriate for what your students are reading. Link to prior knowledge where you can, because students come to class knowing things about the topic. If you can connect with those things, then you've already given students a head start. You can provide sample answers so students know that they're on the right track for any activity or set of questions. If they know that they got one of them right, then they might feel more confident to continue with the activity. And link out to explanatory material. So you can link out to things like simulations. I love simulations because they are an opportunity for students to explore a concept in a way that's not always very linguistically loaded, I guess you would say. And yet they can, explore the concept, build an understanding of the concept, and then they would need to describe it and use the language that's the target language of the classroom. So I have a source for some excellent simulations for topics that I think you'd like to see. That's coming up in a bit. So we can scaffold learning too. Providing sample correct answers, as we said, let students know that they're approaching the activity in the right way. Sample student work. If there was one thing that I think students respond to the most, it's seeing what the product is supposed to be. A good product, or maybe one that's not great, maybe one that has some issues with it, because that lets students kind of apply what they're being told they're supposed to do. They see it in this paper. They don't know whose paper it is. It was, contributed by a previous student, but they can see these are the kinds of things that students will do in this activity, and you should look for these, and here's how you can address these kind of issues. So I think including student work is a tremendous idea, and I don't think it's done as much as it could be. Planning, monitoring, and evaluation tasks. So you kind of, if students have a task to do, you provide guidance for how they're supposed to complete that task, how they know when they're done, how they know that they've done a good job, include the rubric in the material. Modeling and think alouds, if you can find ways of providing that kind of support. And any kind of other activities for helping students build their own metacognition. We saw that is one step to creating a confident student. Sounds great, doesn't it? However, just like everything else in the teaching world, it's a lot more complex than it looks. So what we're going to do now is talk about how you can get started, what stuff you can work with, and then what you can do with it. So the first question, we're going back to that slide about how can you get CLIL or EMI materials. And I highlighted that we're going to go with the last option here. The last option, it is work, and it does require resources to do, but it also creates the most satisfactory product. The materials that are most relevant for your students in your course, the materials that are at the level that you know students need. So we're going to take something authentic and we're going to turn it into teaching material. Before I go there though, I've got my first slide for questions. So Noemi, I'm ready when you are.
Yeah. Thanks, Julianne. So we have here some great questions. Let me read them for you. Can you provide an example of discursification? I'm having problems moving from theory to reality.
Yes. So just as we saw in the scaffolding strategies, I'm going to actually show you some examples from materials that we created. And you're going to see discursification the way that I understand it. And you kind of see how you can pull together the things that you need. It is a juggling act. You're kind of trying to coordinate a lot of different things at the same time. Making materials or adapting materials is a pretty complex operation. We'll take some examples.
Okay, and then the next one. What do you find to be the biggest challenge to adapting authentic texts for EMI contexts? Can you provide specific example?
Yeah, there are a lot of challenges. Some of them might be unique to the EMI setting, but for me, I think moving from the consumer of instructional materials to the creator of instructional materials, that was a bigger leap than I ever thought it was going to be. For me and for the faculty that I work with at Cecil, there's a lot more involved. So it seems like it might just be a matter of taking a text, adding some questions, and I don't know, adding in an activity with some instructions. Okay, that's a start, but then you begin to see when your students use the materials that they get lost or that the materials don't create the depth of thinking that you want in the classroom. So that's a challenge. Just, how, should they look when they're done if you don't have an example to look at? Where do we find stuff to work with? That was another big challenge for all of us. How do we put it into a form that is accessible for the students, particularly the students who use assistive technology? We've had that challenge also. How to make it accessible for things like screen readers, for example. We're still working on it. That's another dimension of complexity in this project. Choosing topics. So for my context, that was an issue because we wanted some kind of thematic coherence to the materials we were creating. So we did use themes, and that was limiting in a way that was a little frustrating for a lot of the teachers at Cecil, because our themes was like American studies, American in this case being United States. And so the teachers needed to select topics within the umbrella theme of American studies and then create instructional units around those. And so at the same time, they're trying to think of what topic do I want? Can I find like materials and videos for that topic? What learning outcomes am I addressing? How am I going to address them? Is there an assessment that I'm going to be doing? And all of this is stuff you consider simultaneously because it's all interrelated. That's a really complex operation. So that's how I experience the challenges.
So great. There are lots of questions today. The next one is, do you have a recommendation for working with hyperlinks and margin notes? Are there any easy resources or programs? What do you think?
Yeah, there's one that I'll put into chat that is an open source kind of project. And Noemi, if you can put that into Facebook comments, or thank you, Jennifer. So Hypothesis is a way of annotating online text, whether that's a PDF or a web page or something along those lines. So it's something that's kind of done online. It gives students a good way of kind of interacting with the text and seeing what other people have done on the same document. So that is a good place to start. There are some other ones. This one, I'm a little less familiar with it, but our university is adopting it. So I believe that's how it's spelled, Perusall. And that's almost a social networking approach to interacting with texts. It's really, really interesting. I mean, they allow you to do things like comment, annotate, but they also let you do things like it and rate it. So it kind of taps into all that interaction that goes along with social networking, but in the context of interacting with academic texts. So those are interesting, but you don't have to be fancy. So you can create a simple hyperlink in a Word document that links to a dictionary definition. So if you want an open source dictionary, Wiktionary is one that is openly licensed, so you don't have to worry that you're linking to something that is, belongs to somebody who's going to have a problem with that. So you can link. You can use the comment feature in Word or something similar, like Google Docs. Just create those little comments along the side in particular areas. So it can be as fancy as you want or as simple as you want, but there are a lot of options. We're lucky that we live in the time of hypermedia, so we're able to do that. All right, so let's take a look at open educational resources. So this is my favorite topic of all time, so I tend to talk about this one very enthusiastically and with more detail than most people need. Open educational resources are anything that is licensed in a way that allows you to redistribute it to other people, to keep it for yourself, to combine different content from different sources, to revise it and maybe create a version that is appropriate for your context, to reuse it, give it to other people, and just let it free in the world of education. So they're open educational resources because the assumption is that you're going to use them for an educational purpose, but the licenses that are involved aren't specific to education necessarily. So this is what an OER should allow you to do. Keep it, retain it, redistribute it, pass it out to your colleagues, reuse it in a new context, revise it, adapt it, change it, and remix it, combine stuff together. And so we're going to take a look at some of those in just a minute here. Creative Commons licenses frequently look like this. They'll have the CC in the circle. That's different from the C in the circle, which in the United States at least refers to copyrighted content for which all the rights are reserved. So this icon on the left here. That means that the author of that content has the right to decide when it's going to be reused, who can change it, whether you can like archive it and save it for later. So things that are indicated with an all rights reserved mark, those are not openly licensed. But things like on the right hand side that have a Creative Commons license attached to them, we can do all of those 5 R's with those things. You might see the licenses reflected as you see them on the right here. So they'll have different combinations of icons and they mean different things. So I'll explain in a second what each one of these licenses kind of indicates. But if you look for a Creative Commons license, either it'll be a text kind of piece of information. It'll say, this is licensed with a Creative Commons 4.0 international license that allows you to redistribute and change it as long as you don't, or as long as you attribute the original author. So it might be written out in text, or it might have one of these licenses, these images attached. If you don't see something that says it's openly licensed or Creative Commons licensed or something similar, a similar kind of open license, I tell my colleagues that we can't assume that it is. A lot of stuff is on the internet and you can go get it and you can download it and you can keep it on your hard drive. But just the availability does not make it openly licensed. It needs to say that it's openly licensed. So that's important for legal considerations and just for integrity purposes. These are the individual kind of circles that you might see on a license that's a Creative Commons license. The first one with the little man here, or the little person that says BY, that means that you need to attribute the original author or source of the information. You need to say where you got it, who originally published it. So most Creative Commons licenses have the BY restriction on them. Not odious, it's not difficult to do that. You simply attribute authorship. So if it has an NC condition on it, then that means you cannot reuse it for commercial purposes. You can't take it and then resell it. So if it's being used for like a commercial purpose and it has an NC license on it, then the NC license says commercial purpose or commercial uses are not permitted. You might have an SA license. This one to me is a little confusing, but what it means is that you need to release that material under the same license as the original. So if the original was CC BY SA, then you need to release that under that same license, CC BY SA. The expectation is that the material will continue to go out into the educational sphere under the same licensing conditions. Okay, and then there's an ND. An ND just means that if you use this material and you adapt it, don't release the adapted version of it. So anything, if you've made any changes in something with an ND license, then that should not be redistributed. So the owner of the copyright, because Creative Commons licenses are copyright, these the author of a license that includes an ND condition wants that material to remain unchanged in the internet sphere, I guess. They don't want lots of different versions of it floating around. So the way that I understand it, if you have a no derivatives license, then you can change it for your own purposes. But you know, if you're going to send it back out into the world on the internet, then it should not be in an altered form. Okay, so what kinds of OER can we find? The answer is pretty much anything can have a Creative Commons license on it if it's copyrightable work. So I've got an example here of a textbook. I won't really, well, I wasn't going to show it to you, but I guess I am now. So Creative Commons licensed textbooks, they might have like a version you can read online. They might have a version that you can download and change and adapt. Pressbooks is a platform that is pretty widely used for openly licensed textbooks on all sorts of topics. This happens to be one about information literacy and using sources for research. You'll see that it is Creative Commons Attribution Required License, CC BY. It's a simple license, very straightforward. But you can read it online, and in some cases you can also download the document. All right, so that would be a textbook. Other things that we have here. Oh my goodness, where did it go? Here we go. So there are entire courses that are openly licensed. Courses where everything's there and you can adapt it as you need it. So one of the sources of those is Lumen Learning. I'm not going to click the link because I think maybe we should just get to the good part. There are instructional activities, lesson plans, just like you might expect, multimedia and digital content. So this digital content includes things like simulations. And I want to show you just one simulation by one author of this kind of content that we've used at Cecil. And it's about the prisoner's dilemma, that thought experiment in game theory of whether people should decide to cooperate with each other or kind of defect, or yeah, I guess defect would be a good word to use. But it's a playable simulation, and it is released under a CC0 license, which actually I think it's a public domain license. So you're able to use this in any way you see fit. So the author of this is the author of many other simulations along these lines. So if you want to have a good time and some enjoyable learning simulations, check this site out. But let me get back to my, all right. So those are the kinds of things you might look for. There are a lot of repositories available for you. So these are a few of these. I think if you're just getting started, you might want to look at the Open Textbook Library, and you'll see that it is just a repository of textbooks for academic subjects of all kinds. Those textbooks are there for you to use. They're openly licensed. They're used at universities. So in the United States, you may have heard that university education is rather expensive. And one of the largest costs for students is textbooks. Textbooks are extremely expensive. And so many courses at many universities are moving toward low-cost degrees or moving toward the use of openly licensed textbooks like the ones that we're looking at now. So if you want to check out what's available in those areas, the Open Textbook Library is great. OASIS is also extremely helpful. And a lot of these will actually, they're just kind of aggregating links from different places. So some of the content might be repeated across these different sites. A lot of good stuff. And if you are a teacher of English as a second or foreign language, then you definitely need to try out American English. It's a wonderful resource. And also VOA Learning English is a good source of content that's been adapted for English language learners. So all of these links are clickable. So when you get your slides, you can actually go visit these sites yourself. This is the Open Textbook Library, but I'm not sure you can see it on your screen, so I won't pursue it too much more. All right, so you can go there. If you want to start, if you're an EMI instructor, of course, you're going to go to look for materials on the topics that you're teaching. Okay. The other thing you can do is you can go to the spreadsheet that we've created at Cecil. At Cecil, we've been involved in a project that's going on for a couple of years now, where we're creating our own textbooks, content-based textbooks for ESL classes. And someone asked about challenges to doing that. One of the biggest challenges was, where do we get material we can work with? So we started kind of compiling this list, and there are tabs at the bottom for different types of content, but you can explore this list too. It's open to you. The URL is right here, tinyurl.com/CecilOER. I refer to it frequently, and I add to it as often as I come across something that would be useful. So we've seen that when we create EMI materials or CLIL materials, we want to start with authentic stuff. We don't want our students to get a watered down ESL version of something that was written by a non-expert. We want them to be using the stuff, the real stuff. So you can get that with OER. You can get authentic academic language. These textbooks are peer reviewed, and they're used in university settings. They're written by experts in their fields. So it is not like a second choice or second best to commercial materials. They're reputable, so they're a good source for our students. The open license lets you adapt them. That is crucial. So if you adopt a chapter from a textbook, your students are going to need some help. And having an open license, it lets you do all the scaffolding that you need to do. Okay, it facilitates collaboration among faculty. And what I had in mind here is having a content expert and a language teaching expert collaborate on creating these materials. Because another challenge is, coming up with the things you're going to do with that material. So thinking about, do I want a collaborative activity here? What kind of project do I want them to do? Working with other faculty is really helpful for making decisions like that and kind of expanding your own view of what you can do with materials. And it's low cost. That's always a consideration. Okay, examples. Pimenta Velasquez and Pavon Vasquez came up with another list of kind of a wish list of what EMI materials should include or how they should be created. What are some priorities? So the content should be clear, objectives for learning should be clear, content should be presented in multiple ways, activities and tasks should be authentic, and connections to prior knowledge. This probably sounds familiar because the Mejisto list that we saw earlier says a lot of the same stuff. So language is presented as a means to understanding the content, as the vehicle for the content. It's scaffolded. It allows students chances to verbalize, concepts as they understand them. It looks at aspects of academic language that are relevant. Students need to know them. And things are presented in multiple modalities to make it more comprehensible. Okay, other things to try and include: promotion of interaction. We've seen over and over in these webinars that we want students to be interacting with each other in that target language. So we want that built into our materials. Task-based learning, for similar reasons, students are constructing the knowledge. So after kind of acquisition of knowledge, the students kind of co-construct that next level of understanding and through task-based learning. And opportunities for collaborative and cooperative learning. So students are interacting with each other. The activities are structured clearly so students know how they're supposed to go about doing that. Work with text genres. So including different genres of content in the materials that you're using. So students will see, this is what a lab report looks like, this is what an academic article looks like. And they can compare, contrast those features maybe, or just have the experience working with both of them. So use different genres. Scaffold language and content, we've talked about quite a lot. And build in some assessments. So these assessments, of course, are going to be aligned to your learning outcomes and to the things that you're trying to teach, but there are opportunities for formal and informal assessment, opportunities for formative and summative assessment. So students, are assessing themselves, assessing each other, the teacher is assessing, and there's always kind of an indication of students, how students are progressing. All right, the CECIL project, as I said before, was when we created textbooks. We have an IEP, which is an intensive English program that it can expand up to about 7 levels. And then on top of that, we also have a university preparation program where students take 4 credit classes, and they're supported by the ESL teachers at CECIL as they're taking these 4 credit classes: history, anthropology, maybe even something like a first-year composition class that they would experience at the university. They take them, they get credit for them, and they get supported. We couldn't find the materials that would be appropriate to do a lot of that stuff. So we started a project that's been going on a few years, and we're creating these materials. All the way from A1 students to students who are beginning university studies, but the range is about, our focus is A2 to B2. Most of our students come in at a level in that range somewhere and tend to leave at the B2 level when they continue to university. So we've created materials for reading, for oral communication, for written communication, and for university preparation classes. We've taken a content-based approach. We did want something that kind of would lead into university type language use. So we started with a content-based approach. We did use a thematic kind of framework at first because we wanted some coherence between the different units of the different classes. And everything was based on OER that was adapted and expanded and rediscursified by the faculty. These are a little small to see on the screen, so if you're following on the slides, it'll be easier to see it there. But the first chapter that we're going to look at is one for an upper, I guess, high intermediate reading class for students. The topic was nanotechnology, and the outcomes, the goals that I had for this one when I developed it were students would be able to read academic and scientific writing. So there's an actual academic article included in here that's been adapted. Students will work with figures and visual diagrams, charts, and things. They'll be able to verbalize that and kind of comprehend that. And there was a linguistic goal too, which was to look at collocations. So words that tend to occur together in certain contexts. And so you'll see that we've incorporated a lot of these different scaffolding approaches here. This graphic organizer that you see on the screen is something students do after they've read an introductory article, which was pretty short, and watched a video. Then they did this to kind of consolidate their knowledge about that. Then there was a reading strategy. This is an approach to reading academic articles. And so they watch a video that kind of introduces this strategy. They have to take notes about how the strategy works and what is the order of things that you read in an academic article. Our students think when they have an academic article, they should start at the very top with the title and just read from beginning to end. And that maybe is not always the most efficient way to read academic articles. So we explicitly teach this strategy. And then in this part of the same chapter, we've got an adapted academic article. It's a scientific article written by a scientist. It was adapted in language I think in the speaker notes at the bottom here, I've got a link to the original article. Okay. All right, but you'll see here that it's got all the parts of an academic article. There's an interactive activity for students to do with the introduction. So they do a little jigsaw and kind of read the introduction and compare their notes on that. Here's all the parts of an authentic academic article. And you'll notice that the diagrams are as they would be in an article in a journal. And so they have opportunities to work with all of this stuff. So we've rediscursified it. Here's rediscursification right here. After they've worked with the article, they've annotated it, they've read it using the strategies, then there are comprehension questions, which is a pedagogical thing that's being added to a scientific article, turning it from a scientific article into teaching material. That's discursification. Over here, we got to focus on language. They're working with collocations here based on things that they saw in the article. Ideally, they're going to generalize this to knowing that collocations are an important part of knowing how to use a word in English. Okay, and then we have another example here, which is totally different topic. This one is remix culture. It's about actually openly licensed content and the open license movement. So here we've included a graphic organizer, and the graphic organizer allows students to synthesize reading from two different sources that were included in this chapter. So they've got to kind of identify the concepts and then organize the concepts here. So the difference between read-only culture and read-write culture, and that comes from the introductory reading. Then we have a different kind of genre here. So Lawrence Lessig is the founder of the open educational, open licensing kind of movement. He wrote a book. His books are openly licensed, and this is an excerpt from one of those. If you read it, if you can get a close-up look at it, you'll notice it's not very academically, it doesn't have an academic tone. It's not written in an academic style. It starts with an anecdote. And so students are introduced to the concept using a genre that is a little bit more accessible. And then as they move on, these pages are a little out of order here. There is a language focus. This time it is on word forms for different parts of speech. And then there's some visuals in there to kind of drive home the idea of mixing and remixing and what this whole movement is about. So I included spam musubi. If you've never had spam musubi, you should try it. It's very interesting and a very good example of remix culture. But you'll see here that now the text on the right-hand side here is from an article that was written by I think it's the World Intellectual Property Organization, maybe, WIPO, but it is very academic. The style or the level of writing, the register is very high. So we've gone from Lawrence Lessig and his anecdotes over to something that's more of a legal discussion. Okay, but we're building in opportunities for students to use metacognitive skills. In this case, it's questioning. We saw, I believe, last week. And then we went from authentic materials, whether that be a textbook chapter. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. So this is how we rediscursified. We took this original stuff, we added the instructional component to it, and the final result were these chapters that we created. So locating the OER was a challenge. It required you to kind of rethink the concept for the chapters that you had in mind based on what was available to work with, which was not always very extensive. Training. We did a lot of training and a lot of professional development. Being a content creator, being a designer of instructional materials, is a different skill set than instruction. And then it's a natural progression from being an instructor to being a materials creator, but it also requires the addition of some skills. Okay, so structuring materials, how we were going to make these materials scaffolded and comprehensible. Aligning content and activities to outcomes, that was a challenge for us. So I originally wanted every chapter to have the outcomes included in the chapter, but we haven't gotten there yet. So that's going to be part of our revision cycle. And time and resources. It's a time-consuming process to do this. So it doesn't happen overnight. It's not creating a worksheet. It's creating a curriculum in document form. So students, our teachers, moving into developing their own materials, it is time consuming, it can be resource intensive, but it is also a great way of developing your practice as an instructor. So there is a benefit from it. It makes you reflect very closely on how you approach instruction, because you're actually working, you're creating the tools that you're going to use with the students. So it is a wonderful growth experience. And my quote to end our webinar for today is that we need to go beyond textbooks. I tell people that I work with that textbooks don't teach. Teachers teach. They use the textbooks to do that. They use their materials to do that. But teachers are the ones that turn that stuff on the page into knowledge for their students. Well, students, of course, construct the knowledge, but we need to move beyond the idea that the textbooks are the teacher and that we're just here to turn the pages. We want our students to get an experience of the content, experience of the field, and to do that we have to think a little bit bigger than just textbooks putting knowledge into people's heads. So that's it as far as content. We're here at our second Q&A slide, so I'd love to hear your thoughts or your comments.
Hi, Julianne. We have a good question. How do you find and use student samples as authentic materials? Do you ask for permission?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I know that there are legal restrictions in different countries. In the United States, we have what's called FERPA, which means that students, or in the case of a minor, the parents of the students, control access to information about a student's learning, which means that student educational records are private. We need to get permission before we can use any of that. And so at Cecil, we work with adult students. All of our students are of age. So we've been debating how we're going to approach this. We do have, small scale permission to use, an excerpt or something. One thing that we have done in the past is after grades have been finished and completed and the course is over, then we'll send out a request for permission to use work of the students, and students can decide, yes, that's okay, no, it's not okay, but they indicate their agreement or lack of agreement on the survey, and then we know that we can use, materials that they've created. We don't want it to be coercive. We don't want to feel like, oh, you made it for my class, now it belongs to me. So we don't want to go that route. Now we would like to have more of a kind of an umbrella form that gives us kind of more broad permission to use student work, but it always is going to require the students' consent to incorporate.
Okay, good to know about that too. Yeah, and with that, I guess that's all the questions we have today. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, Julianne.
All right. I look forward to seeing everyone at the workshops tomorrow. Have a great day.
Okay. We're off the air, I hope.
Phew.
No, we are.
Great.
Let me stop recording.